Time is slipping away, and every moment you let pass will never come back. You can't get back the days you lived on autopilot, or the opportunities you let die because of fear or comfort. Dostoevsky knew this better than anyone. He understood that life isn't just a sequence of days. It's a constant battle against inertia, against cowardice, and against the lies we tell ourselves to justify a mediocre existence. In his words, living the wrong way isn't just a mistake. It's a risk that can destroy everything you are, slowly eating away at your freedom and your dignity. And the worst part? Most people don't even realize they're trapped in this cage until it's too late. In today's video, Dostoevsky warns us about the danger of not living right and invites us to face, without fear, the truths we avoid about our own lives. The Underground Man, a character created by Dostoevsky in Notes from Underground, is an uncomfortable portrait of something we all know too well: the tendency to put life off. He's not a hero nor a moral example, but a mirror showing us how passivity eats away at the soul. His confession isn't an invitation to complacency, but a warning. Life isn't just what happens to us. It's what we do with what happens to us. Standing still, waiting for circumstances to change on their own, is sentencing yourself to watch your own existence pass before your eyes. The passivity Dostoevsky condemns isn't just physical, it's mental and spiritual. It begins when we convince ourselves that it's not worth trying, or that the right time hasn't come yet. This is the self-deception that fuels inertia, the temporary comfort of believing we still have time, when in reality, every day spent waiting is a day lost. The Underground Man knows this, and that's why he torments himself. He understands that his paralysis is a choice, and that awareness hurts more than any failure ever could. Ancient philosophies warned against this trap. Seneca, in On the Shortness of Life, wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." Inertia isn't just the absence of action, it's an active choice not to live. Aristotle would say, virtue is in deliberate action, in pursuing a worthy goal. Standing still is abandoning that responsibility. And when we step away from action, we create space for emptiness to fill us. And emptiness is rarely neutral. It fills with regret. Passivity is dangerous because it disguises itself as prudence. How many times have we delayed a project, a meeting, a decision under the excuse of "I'm not ready yet"? This is self-deception's favorite rationalization. The Underground Man sees this internal game. He crafts elaborate justifications for his inaction, but deep down, he knows he's avoiding risk. And avoiding risk is avoiding life, because living always means stepping into unknown territory. Years later, Nietzsche would echo the same warning. The danger is not taking any danger. Staying safe is actually choosing a slow death. The death of a spirit that settles for only reacting to life instead of creating something new. The Underground Man rebels against this slow death, even if in a twisted and self-destructive way. His rebellion, paradoxically, is proof of life. He feels the weight of not acting, and that alone sets him apart from those who don't even notice they're stuck. Refusing passivity takes courage. Courage to face not only the world, but your own reflection. Because when we look honestly, we see that many of the excuses we tell ourselves are nothing but fear in disguise. Fear of failure, fear of being judged, fear of discovering we're not as capable as we thought. Dostoevsky shows us that this fear is universal, but living with it doesn't mean being ruled by it. True freedom is acting despite it. And here's the key point. Action doesn't need to be grand to break passivity. Often it's in small gestures, sending that message, writing the first line, getting out of bed even when you feel no motivation, that transformation begins. The Underground Man challenges us to see that not acting out of fear of failing is accepting defeat before the battle even starts. And that kind of surrender is more painful than any real failure. However, refusing passivity doesn't mean acting blindly or compulsively. It means acting with awareness, deliberately choosing the next step. Seneca reminded us that no wind is favorable to a sailor without a destination, and action without purpose can be just as empty as inaction. The difference is that conscious action builds something, even if at first it's just a habit, a push away from stagnation. Kierkegaard's existential philosophy also fits here. For him, anxiety is the sign that we're standing before possibility. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's also a privilege, because it means we can choose. Passivity kills that possibility before it has a chance to become real. The underground man lives in the tension between knowing he can choose and feeling incapable of doing so. And that's the same abyss where many of us live. If we want to refuse passivity, we must first recognize where it hides. It lives in, "I'll start tomorrow," in, "I'm not ready," in, "I'll think about it later." It grows stronger. Each day we repeat a routine that no longer challenges us, just because it feels comfortable. Dostoevsky isn't asking us to destroy our lives to prove we're free. He's inviting us not to waste them in a waking sleep. And maybe that's the most disturbing thing about the underground man. He shows us that sometimes we don't act not because we lack opportunity, but because the habit of inertia has already become part of our identity. It's painful to admit that we're, in part, responsible for our own prisons. But that admission is also the first step to leaving them. We can only change what we're willing to see clearly. In practice, refusing passivity is a daily exercise. It's asking yourself each morning, what can I do today to pull myself away from inertia? It doesn't have to be heroic. It has to be real. That's how the spirit grows stronger, in the sum of small acts of choice. Each step breaks the cycle of self-deception. And by breaking that cycle, we begin to live not as spectators, but as protagonists. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky creates a character who lives in a constant, painful state of observation. The underground man doesn't just notice what's happening around him, he notices what that awareness means. He doesn't just analyze events, he analyzes his own reactions to them, and even the motives behind those reactions. It's a level of clarity that goes beyond the ordinary and becomes unbearable. This hyper-awareness stops him from fully engaging with the world. Any impulse to act is immediately cut short by a deep inspection of the possible consequences, contradictions, and inevitable mistakes. He can't simply live. He feels the need to first understand everything, and in understanding, he freezes. It's as if every step is preceded by 1,000 calculations and doubts, until the moment to act has already passed. Dostoevsky doesn't present this as a pure virtue. On the contrary, excessive awareness is shown as a kind of inner prison. At times, the underground man even envies those who act simply, almost instinctively, without torturing themselves with endless considerations. To him, those people live on the surface, maybe less deeply, but far more practically. He, trapped in the deep layers of reflection, watches life happen from a distance. For this character, awareness is not just a light that illuminates. It's also a weight that makes movement harder. The more he understands about himself and others, the more he sees the incoherence and imperfection of human nature. And this constant perception leads him into irony and cynicism, a defense against the frustration of not acting. There's a moment when the underground man practically admits that his clarity is a bitter pleasure. He knows this knowledge isolates him, but he would rather be isolated than live under an illusion. There's pride in his sharp vision, but also pain. It's as if awareness is a coin with two sides. On one side, the freedom of not being fooled. On the other, the inability to fully give yourself to life without holding back. Dostoevsky seems to be exploring an uncomfortable truth here. Knowing too much about yourself and the world doesn't necessarily mean living better. In fact, it can mean living less, not in terms of time, but in terms of intensity. The underground man sees all the possible paths, but none seem worth taking, because all of them have imperfections he refuses to tolerate. This is the tragedy of his clarity. It gives him vision, but not direction. His stagnation doesn't come from a lack of opportunities. It comes from refusing any path that isn't perfect. and since perfection is impossible, he'd rather stay still, observing, criticizing, and mentally dismantling every possibility. Life becomes a theater he watches from the shadows, commenting on every act but never stepping on stage. This portrait is powerful because we recognize parts of it in ourselves. Who hasn't been caught in a cycle of overthinking, analyzing, until the courage to act slips away? Who hasn't let an opportunity pass because we needed to understand it better first? The underground man is an exaggerated literary figure, but also a mirror that reflects a very real human tendency. And here's Dostoevsky's central point. Awareness is inevitable for anyone seeking authenticity, but if it's not paired with action, it decays into stagnation. The burden isn't just in what we see, but in what we fail to do because of what we see. This is where other thinkers come into the conversation. Blaise Pascal, for example, described the human condition as a tension between greatness and misery. For him, being aware of both, our rational power and our fragility, could lead to despair. And just like the underground man, that clarity doesn't come with a guide on how to live. Arthur Schopenhauer saw something similar. The clearer the vision, the more obvious the inevitable suffering of life becomes. That's why so many people choose to distract themselves with shallow pleasures and artificial concerns. It's a form of self-preservation against the weight of truth. The difference is that while the underground man takes pride in not deceiving himself, Schopenhauer suggested that detachment and letting go of certain desires could ease the burden. Kierkegaard approached the problem as the anxiety of possibility. For him, too much awareness opens up endless paths, and the inability to choose is what paralyzes us. The underground man is almost the embodiment of this idea. He sees every possible future, but none feel pure or safe enough. The result? He chooses none. In Eastern tradition, the Buddha also recognized the weight of awareness, but offered a different way, not to run from it, but to use it to see reality exactly as it is, without clinging and without aversion. In that sense, clarity wouldn't be a wall, but a door to freedom. What the underground man may have never realized is that lucidity doesn't have to kill movement, it can guide it. Simone Weil would add that deep attention, total awareness, is an act of love. But for it to be love, it must open to the world, not close in on itself. That's the challenge Dostoevsky leaves us. How to keep our clarity without letting it turn into a cocoon. How to turn the burden into strength. Awareness, when used wisely, is a compass. Without action, it's just weight. With action, it's direction. And maybe that's the final lesson the underground man, despite not living fully, offers us. Lucidity is dangerous, but choosing blindness is fatal. The underground man looks at those who live as if life were a math problem and feels something close to contempt. He imagines their predictable routines, their decisions justified by neat lists of pros and cons, and he smiles with bitter irony. To him, reducing existence to an equation is mutilating it. It's like trying to explain a storm with a weather manual. The manual might be correct, but it doesn't feel the wind, hear the thunder, or get soaked in the rain. Cold logic, for this character, is an enemy disguised as order. It promises safety, but demands, as payment, the surrender of what makes us unpredictable. The social reformers of his time spoke of perfect systems, of ideal cities where everything would run like clockwork. The underground man answers with sarcasm. Even if everything were perfect, humans would find a way to break it, just to prove they're free. This is the essence of his rebellion. Freedom to him includes the right to act against his own calculated interest, to act absurdly, to make decisions that neither maximize pleasure nor minimize pain, but that affirm something deeper: will. Dostoevsky turns this gesture into a challenge to rationalist determinism. It's as if he's saying, predict all you want, but there will always be a grain of sand in the machine, and that grain is human. In his underground world, The protagonist is surrounded by theories that try to box human behavior into fixed laws. He doesn't deny those laws exist, but insists that something always escapes, the unpredictable. And not only does it escape, it's precisely in that leftover where he sees true life. An existence reduced to forecasts and results would, for him, be unbearable. Better chaos than mechanical peace. Dostoevsky isn't blindly praising irrationality. What he points out is that logic, when made absolute, becomes inhuman. It can't explain why someone risks their life for a lost cause, or why an artist starves to finish a work that might never be recognized. There's something in these acts that refuses to be reduced to calculations. And for the underground man, that's where the core of human experience lies. The point is so radical that he claims humans are capable of destroying their own happiness just to prove they're not slaves to reason. Is it self-sabotage? Maybe. But it's also a cry against any theory that tries to lock life inside a perfect system. This rebellion is both self-destructive and liberating. It preserves unpredictability, even if it wounds the one rebelling. In the second half of this reflection, we can hear echoes of this view in other philosophers, and also see contrasts. Nietzsche, for example, would see in the rejection of cold logic an affirmation of the Dionysian spirit, that creative and chaotic force opposing the Apollonian, orderly and rational. For him, living fully requires embracing both order and chaos, without letting order kill the creative power of disorder. William James, the American pragmatist, believed that life couldn't be reduced to formulas because the value of an action isn't just in its final outcome, but in the subjective experience of doing it. This aligns directly with Dostoevsky. Even a useless choice can have intrinsic value if it expresses something essential about who we are. Bergson joins this debate by criticizing the tendency to think of life in purely mechanical terms. For him, existence is élan vital, a creative impulse that can't be captured by fixed models. Cold logic freezes reality. Life, on the other hand, is continuous movement. That movement includes detours, mistakes, and improvisation. Exactly what the underground man defends. From an Eastern perspective, Taoism, through Laozi, also looks skeptically at rigid logic. The Tao Te Ching suggests that trying to fully control the flow of life is pointless. The wise adapt to the unpredictable instead of fighting to impose absolute order. Here, the unpredictable isn't a threat, but an essential part of the path. The contrast becomes clear when we think of philosophers like Bentham or the utilitarians, for whom calculating reason is the foundation of ethics. They'd argue that maximizing well-being is the only sensible direction for human action. To them, the underground man would be an irrational figure, wasting energy. But it's in this tension that Dostoevsky's character gains strength. He exposes that, by following only calculation, we might end up with an efficient life, but one without a soul. The rebellion against cold logic isn't a denial of reason, but a refusal to accept it as the ultimate master. It's the recognition that humans, in their freedom, need room for the unexpected gesture, for the decision that can't be explained by numbers. That's where art, love, courage, and yes, mistakes, live. The underground man would rather risk being wrong than live under the tyranny of mathematical perfection. He knows it may mean suffering, but for him, chosen suffering is more dignified than imposed comfort. In this sense, Dostoevsky isn't inviting us to chaos for chaos's sake, but to the acceptance that chaos is an inevitable and valuable part of life. The world doesn't need to stop you. Your own thoughts are enough. Something as simple as walking through a door turns into a long internal meeting. First, you picture the advantages. Then, the risks. Next, you start questioning the hidden motives behind your own desire to act. By the time you realize it, too much time has passed. The moment is gone, and with it, any real chance to act. All that's left is the feeling that, I just wasn't ready yet. This is where self-sabotage thrives, not in thoughtless mistakes, but in overthinking. The underground man is an expert at delaying the inevitable until it no longer exists. He's proud of his clarity, but that clarity often works like a net that traps him. By mentally taking apart every decision, he turns life into a collection of theories that are never tested. The quest for total consistency, for an action without any contradiction, any risk, any possible flaw, is the perfect way to do nothing. He won't act until he has all the answers, but since answers are never final, the wait becomes endless. It's a wait disguised as moral rigor, but it's really fear. Fear of failure, fear of embarrassment, fear of losing control. The most ironic part is that the underground man knows he's fooling himself. Dostoevsky gives him a mind too sharp to fully believe his own excuses. He can see he's building traps for himself, but keeps building them, almost as if paralysis feels safer than facing the weight of an imperfect result. It's a way of living in theory, shielded from the impact of reality. In this inner game, self-sabotage becomes almost an art form. He can come up with brilliant arguments to justify every non-action. He'll talk about prudence, integrity, even staying true to himself. But deep down, he's just avoiding the discomfort that comes with taking a real step. The search for perfect consistency becomes a wall, and behind it, life passes by. Dostoevsky shows that this kind of self-sabotage isn't exclusive to the underground man. It's a universal trap. We've all, at some point, delayed something under the excuse of needing to think it through. The danger is when that thinking never ends, and time silently decides for us. From here, other philosophers help shine light on this dilemma. Kierkegaard, for example, would say the underground man suffers from the anxiety of choice, a state where infinite possibilities paralyze action. The more we think about our options, the more lost we get in comparisons, and the further away we get from actually choosing. Hannah Arendt would add that thinking is vital, but action is what truly places a person in the world. For her, action is the only way to break out of inner isolation. By hiding in endless analysis, the underground man gives up on that connection. He lives in the realm of pure thought, but pays the price of leaving no mark on reality. Nietzsche would see this as a kind of disguised nihilism. When you demand so much justification for action, you're really saying nothing is worth doing. The obsession with consistency becomes an elegant excuse to avoid committing to anything, because every commitment has flaws. William James, the pragmatist, would offer a simple antidote. Act as if what you do makes a difference. It does. For James, waiting for perfect conditions is an illusion. It's by acting that we create the conditions we need. This is the reversal the underground man can't make. For him, perfection must come before action, when in reality, for life, it comes after. Even in the Stoic tradition, Marcus Aurelius recognized that too much reflection could become sterile. He advised, if it's within your power, do it. If it's not, accept it. Self-sabotage is precisely wasting time on what is within your reach, but putting it off until it slips away. In Eastern thought, Zen Buddhism offers another key. The mind that demands absolute consistency is a mind afraid of the present. Zen practice invites action in the now, accepting that contradiction is part of life. The goal isn't to erase error, but to avoid being paralyzed by it. The danger of self-sabotage, then, isn't just losing concrete opportunities, it's losing the very ability to act. When the search for consistency becomes an excuse, it creates a mental habit. The habit of waiting for life to sort itself out while we tell ourselves we're just getting ready. Over time, that habit kills any creative impulse. Dostoevsky's lesson here is bitter but clear. Thinking too much about acting can be just as destructive as acting without thinking. Consistency is a useful ideal, but only if it supports movement, not delays it. If we wait to eliminate every uncertainty before we live, life will pass, and we'll pass with it, well-informed spectators, but absent all the same. Imagine a life where every step you take is based on a balance sheet of pros and cons, where every move is carefully calculated to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. For the underground man, that's not freedom. It's an invisible prison. He rejects the idea that a human being should act only according to what is useful, predictable, or safe. For him, freedom begins precisely when we can act against what cold logic tells us is best for us. This rejection isn't theoretical, it's visceral. The underground man knows that, often, the most human impulse isn't to chase the greatest benefits, but to assert your own will, even if it comes at a cost. He even claims that a person is capable of destroying their own happiness just to prove they aren't a slave to rational formulas. It's not about senseless self-harm, it's about protecting a space for decision-making that no calculation can predict. For Dostoevsky, this ability to act against calculated self-interest is the mark of real freedom. If all our choices could be predicted by utilitarian rules, we'd be nothing more than cogs in a machine, following outside laws with no room for the unexpected. The underground man would rather commit a pointless or even harmful act if it proves he isn't fully predictable. This is the same spirit that makes him mock the perfect social models of his time, utopias that promise to eliminate all suffering and conflict through rational organization. He imagines a man placed inside that ordered paradise doing something absurd just to break the monotony. Not out of malice, but to feel that he can still say no to a life that dictates all his yeses. That kind of freedom is dangerous because it also opens the door to self-destructive choices. The underground man knows this, and yet he defends it because he believes the dignity of choosing is worth more than the safety of obeying a calculation. It's a statement that human will doesn't fit on a spreadsheet. Dostoevsky pushes us to ask, if all our actions were decided by what pays off most in terms of pleasure and pain, what would be left of our individuality? We'd be nothing but result-optimizing machines. True freedom means being able to say, I know what would be better for me, but I choose something else. Other philosophers have echoed or challenged this view. Nietzsche, for instance, would see this ability as an expression of the will to power, not acting out of convenience, but as a creative affirmation of the self. An act that defies calculated self-interest can prove we are more than comfort-seeking beings. Kant would frame it differently. For him, moral freedom isn't following desires or calculations, but acting out of duty, based on principles we choose rationally for everyone. That can also mean acting against our immediate interest. A shopkeeper who returns money a customer lost isn't maximizing profit, but affirming moral autonomy. Jean-Paul Sartre would see acting against calculated self-interest as a radical example of freedom, as a kind of condemnation. The fact that we cannot escape choosing. By going against utilitarian logic, we remind ourselves there's no ready-made script. It's a way of saying, I take responsibility for this act, even if it makes no sense to anyone else. Utilitarian thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, on the other hand, would likely see the underground man as irrational, maybe even childish. For them, ethics should aim for the greatest good for the greatest number, and acting against calculated personal or collective interest would be, at best, wasteful, and, at worst, needless destruction. This tension between utilitarianism and absolute freedom is at the heart of the debate Dostoevsky opens. In the Stoic tradition, there's a nuance. Marcus Aurelius, for example, didn't defend acting against reason or against one's own good, but he also didn't define good as something measured by pleasure and pain. For a Stoic, freedom is living according to virtue, even if it costs material advantages. Choosing to take a loss to keep your integrity would be a valid way of acting against utilitarian interest. In Eastern philosophy, Taoism and Zen also challenge the idea of calculated self-interest. Acting spontaneously, following the flow, Wu Wei, might seem irrational through the lens of logic, but paradoxically it's more in tune with life's nature. Letting go of attachment to results is, here, a form of freedom. What unites all these perspectives is the idea that freedom isn't just choosing what gives us the biggest immediate gain. It's the ability, in certain moments, to choose what affirms our humanity, even if it goes against what looks rational on paper. It's the gesture of someone who would rather be imperfect and free than perfect and predictable. The underground man reminds us, if we give up this possibility, we give up something essential, the ability to surprise not only the world, but ourselves. A freedom that can't say no to its own calculated interest isn't freedom at all. It's obedience wearing a mask. There's something unsettling about the underground man. He seems to find a strange satisfaction in his own pain. It's not that he goes out looking for it directly, but he also doesn't do much to avoid it. At times, he even cultivates it, as if within that pain there were a secret proof that he's still alive. This paradoxical relationship with suffering is one of the most disturbing and fascinating aspects of Dostoevsky's work. For the underground man, suffering isn't just an unwanted accident, it's an essential part of the human experience. He faces it with sharp, almost cruel awareness, like someone examining a wound without looking away. And it's precisely this clarity that keeps him from trivializing pain. Where many try to numb it with distractions, he observes it, analyzes it, and in some way, weaves it into his very identity. This attitude is a direct challenge to the utilitarian mindset, which sees pain as something to be minimized at all costs. The underground man seems to ask, if life were only comfort and pleasure, would it be bearable or unbearable? For him, a life completely free of suffering would also be flat, without depth. Pain gives intensity to joy, just as shadow gives shape to light. The pleasure he finds in suffering is neither sadism nor trivial masochism, but an existential satisfaction. Suffering is proof that he can still feel, that he hasn't been reduced to an indifferent cog in society's machine. For him, pain is a sign of authenticity. Dostoevsky, through many of his characters, suggests that a fully conscious life isn't made up only of pleasant moments. Awareness means looking straight at the harshest parts of existence and accepting them as inevitable. To deny suffering, for the underground man, is to deny the human condition itself, and paradoxically, accepting it can bring a strange peace, because you stop wasting energy fighting what cannot be avoided. What's most provocative is that at times, he seems to deliberately prolong his pain. He holds grudges, replays humiliations, mentally revisits old arguments like someone picking at a scar. There's a trap here. The same awareness that could set him free also keeps him bound, turning pain into an emotional addiction. This is where pleasure in suffering becomes ambiguous, both a strength and a weakness. Dostoevsky's take on this finds echoes in other thinkers, even if from different angles. Nietzsche, for example, saw suffering as inevitable and, more than that, indispensable for growth. His concept of amor fati, love of fate, urges us to embrace not just what is good, but also what is painful, as inseparable parts of life. For him, to try to erase pain is also to erase the conditions for overcoming and for creating meaning. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, saw suffering as the core of existence. Instead of seeking pleasure in it, he advised adopting an attitude of resignation and compassion, recognizing that everyone carries the same burden. This view aligns with the underground man in its awareness of pain's inevitability, but differs in how it's used. The Stoics, like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, taught that pain in itself is neither good nor bad. What matters is how we interpret it. For them, accepting unavoidable pain is a sign of virtue, because it means not being enslaved by what we can't control. The underground man takes this acceptance into a more psychological territory. He doesn't just tolerate pain, he integrates it into his personal story. In Eastern thought, Buddhism offers another perspective. The Buddha identified suffering, dukkha, as a fundamental reality of life, but also pointed to a way to transcend its grip by understanding its roots in attachment and aversion. Here, pleasure in suffering doesn't make sense, but the serene acceptance of it as part of the spiritual path does. Even Freud, studying the human mind, identified the phenomenon of repeating suffering, the tendency to relive painful experiences as if there was something to resolve in them. For the underground man, this repetition isn't unconscious. He knows he's returning to pain, and on some level, chooses it. It's a way of preserving his identity, of keeping alive the feeling of uniqueness. The danger, of course, is mistaking suffering's existential value for its glorification. Pain can teach, strengthen, and reveal hidden layers of life, but it can also imprison if we cling to it as the only proof that we're real. True awareness means knowing the difference between accepting unavoidable pain and creating unnecessary pain just to feel deep. In the end, the pleasure the underground man finds in suffering is less about chasing pain and more about not running from it. It's rejecting the easy comfort of a shallow life and admitting that to live fully is to hurt. And in a strange way, that acceptance makes the pain more bearable, maybe even beautiful, because it's part of what makes us human. You know the next step is going to cost you. You know the outcome will be loss, pain, or humiliation. You also know you could avoid it all if you stepped back now. But it's exactly that awareness that pushes you forward. Doing something that harms you, deliberately, is your way of shouting to the world, and to yourself, that you still own your choices. In Dostoevsky's underground world, this twisted logic is almost like a personal law. The underground man isn't satisfied with the idea that freedom simply means choosing what benefits you. To him, if our actions are always predictable based on what's most advantageous, then we're nothing more than obedient pieces in a logical machine. Real freedom is only proven when we go against what would be best for us in purely rational terms. This impulse toward conscious self-destruction doesn't come from some blind urge to suffer. It comes from refusing to live by rules that treat us like equations. When he ruins a perfect plan, when he sabotages a situation that could have been comfortable, the underground man feels a dark kind of satisfaction. I can still say no, even if it costs me. Dostoevsky knew this side of human nature is unsettling because it reveals a space of freedom that can't be controlled by political systems or moral theories. It's useless for progress, ineffective for happiness, but essential for existential pride. It's the ability to say, I'm not just the sum of what's good for me, I'm the result of what I choose, even if it's bad. But this radical freedom has a price. The underground man, in using it to assert himself, also digs his own unhappiness. His life is marked by broken relationships, wasted opportunities, and a constant taste of defeat. But for him, it's a chosen defeat, and that's enough to give it meaning. This is the central contradiction Dostoevsky exposes. We might be willing to destroy ourselves to keep the feeling that we're free. And in a way, it's that very willingness that sets us apart from any perfectly predictable mechanism. Other thinkers have wrestled with this idea too. Nietzsche, for example, might see in this attitude traces of resentment, but also a glimpse of the free spirit. For him, self-affirmation should happen through creation, not destruction. But he'd still admit that often, the first act of freedom is to tear down what already exists. One must have chaos within to give birth to a dancing star, he wrote. That chaos might start as self-destruction before it becomes creation. Camus, on the other hand, looking at life's absurdity, might see the underground man's behavior as a radical refusal to live by convenience. In the myth of Sisyphus, the hero is the one who faces life's lack of meaning and still chooses to go on. The underground man does something similar, but in reverse. He even chooses what will hurt him just to prove he won't bow to some imposed sense of meaning. In psychoanalysis, Freud would likely identify this tendency as a form of the death drive, thanatos, the instinct pushing us toward inertia or repeating self-destructive patterns. But with the underground man, this drive is conscious and brandished as a flag of freedom, which makes it even more complex. Sartre's existentialism offers another angle. For him, man is condemned to be free, and therefore responsible for every choice. When you choose something that harms you, you can't blame fate or nature. It's a pure act of authorship. Sartre might criticize the waste of freedom in destruction, but he wouldn't deny that such a gesture is undeniable proof of autonomy. From a utilitarian point of view, this would be seen as a total waste. For thinkers like Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill, an action that deliberately causes more pain than pleasure is irrational and undesirable because it doesn't contribute to overall well-being. The underground man would be, for them, a clear example of how freedom without rational guidance can turn into collective self-sabotage. In the Stoic tradition, someone like Seneca would say that using your freedom to harm yourself is throwing your life away. True freedom, for a Stoic, is acting in harmony with universal reason, not against it. But it's exactly that harmony the underground man rejects. To him, if freedom is only valid when it aligns with what's rational and virtuous, then it's not complete freedom. Even in Eastern spiritual traditions like Zen, there's a contrast. In Zen, destroying what's illusory can be liberating, but destroying yourself purely out of defiance is just another form of attachment, an attachment to your own image as a rebel. In this sense, the underground man is free, but still chained to the need to prove that freedom. So, the question after Dostoevsky, and after all these perspectives, is this: how much of conscious self-destruction is a legitimate exercise of freedom, and how much is just an ego trap? There's a certain greatness in being able to say no to what's good for you, but there's also wisdom in knowing when that no is just an empty gesture. The underground man never resolves this tension. He lives in it. His life is proof that human freedom can be just as destructive as it is creative, and that sometimes we'd rather lose everything than give up the feeling that we still have a choice. It's an unsettling portrait, but maybe a necessary one, of a freedom that can't be calculated, and for that reason alone, remains freedom. You can picture every detail, the perfect conversation, the right decision, even the exact gesture that would change the course of your life. In your mind, everything plays out with clarity and precision, but outside of it, nothing changes. The underground man lives in that space, a private inner territory where everything is possible, but nothing is actually done. For him, thinking feels safer than acting. Reality might challenge his ideas, but inside his mind, he controls all the outcomes. There are no surprises there, no risk of humiliation. But that safety comes at a cost. While he lives in thought, real life passes by without him ever touching it. Dostoevsky portrays this with uncomfortable bluntness. The underground man takes pride in his ability to analyze, yet he knows he's trapped in it. Reflection is like a well-lit room with no doors. He can see everything clearly, but he can't step out into the world. This mental isolation is seductive because it creates the illusion of movement, planning, imagining, calculating. It all feels like action, but it's not. In his underground space, he replays old offenses in his head, imagines conversations that will never happen, reconstructs debates as if he could still win them. And with every cycle, he drifts further from the present. The danger is that the more you live inside your head, the stranger and more hostile reality feels. Small interactions become exhausting. Simple decisions feel like mountains. Year after year, the tangible world grows more distant until it nearly disappears. The underground man knows this, but he'd rather endure boredom and loneliness than face the chaos of acting. This isn't laziness. It's a form of self-preservation gone wrong. He believes that if he thinks long enough, he can avoid mistakes. But the result is the opposite. Without real-world experience, he becomes more fragile, more unprepared to face life. The mind without action becomes a place of repetition, always reviewing the past or rehearsing the future, but never living in the now. Other thinkers have warned about this danger. Aristotle said virtue doesn't come from knowing alone, but from doing. For him, knowledge without practice builds neither character nor fulfillment. Wisdom requires concrete action, and habit shapes who we are. Kierkegaard would call the underground man a victim of infinite reflection, someone who analyzes so much that they never choose. For the Danish philosopher, to live is to risk, and every decision is a leap beyond the safety of analysis. Hannah Arendt, writing about the vita activa, reminded us that action is what places us in the world and gives us a story worth telling. Living only in thought is a kind of social invisibility. You might have brilliant ideas, but without action, they change nothing. Not you, not the world. William James, the pragmatist, would insist that the truth of an idea can only be tested through experience. Untested thoughts are like seeds kept in a drawer. They might have potential, but they'll never grow into trees. Buddhism offers a similar perspective. In meditation, observing thoughts is just the first step. The path of compassion and engagement with the world is essential. Staying stuck in pure contemplation is a detour that blocks growth. Nietzsche, a critic of passive life, would see this mental imprisonment as a sign of decline. For him, life demands affirmation, and to affirm is to create, act, and transform. Thinking is part of life, but it can never replace it. The danger of living only in your mind isn't just losing external experiences. It's losing the internal ability to experience. A mind that never acts starts recycling the same ideas, locking itself into rigid patterns. The underground man is proof. His reflections don't make him freer. They make him more trapped. Dostoevsky leaves us with a clear warning. Thinking is essential, but it's not enough. Reflection that never turns into movement is like a dammed river. The water might stay clear for a while, but it will eventually stagnate. And over time, that stagnation becomes the normal environment, one that's hard to leave. Living only in your mind is dangerous because it convinces you that you're already living. But real life requires contact, mistakes, discomfort, and, above all, presence. The underground man avoids all of that and pays the price of existing more as an observer of himself than as a participant in the world. He remembers, always remembers, every careless word, every look of contempt, every humiliation, old or recent, remains alive as if it happened yesterday. The underground man doesn't let these memories fade. On the contrary, he nurtures them, waters them, and feeds them until they grow into twisted trees that take over every corner of his mind. For him, resentment is a constant companion, both fuel and burden. The memory of the wrongs he suffered gives him a sense of identity. Look at what they did to me. Look at how I survived. But it also keeps him chained to the past. He's no longer living in the present moment. He's reliving every single day, the instant he was hurt. Dostoevsky portrays this as a cruel choice. The underground man knows he could let some things die, but he fears the emptiness that would replace them. Resentment feels like a kind of consistency. If he lets it go, it's as if the suffering didn't matter. So he chooses to carry the weight, even if it drags him down. The problem is that resentment isn't just a static weight. It seeps into everything. When he thinks about a new friendship, a project, an opportunity, he's already bracing for betrayal and disappointment. His relationship with the future is poisoned by the past. It's as if every door he finds is painted the same color as the last one that closed on him. In the underground, this prison feels familiar. He knows the bars by heart and every memory that holds them up. But while he stays there, real life narrows. The present loses its own texture and becomes nothing more than an extension of what has already happened. Resentment is a prison that doesn't need guards, because the prisoner refuses to leave. Other philosophers have also seen resentment as a poison that eats away at life. Nietzsche made it a central concept in his critique of herd morality. For him, resentment is born when someone cannot, or dares not, act against those who wronged them, and so they turn their powerlessness into a virtue. It's the mechanism by which one says, "I chose not to take revenge," when in reality, they simply couldn't. The underground man bears this mark. His bitterness becomes a story that justifies his own paralysis. Seneca, among the Stoics, advised cutting resentment at its root. For him, anger was a kind of mental slavery, and forgiveness, not out of kindness, but out of clarity, was freedom from an enemy that lives inside us. Resentment is useless because it doesn't change the past, and it stops us from acting in the present. In Christianity, thinkers like Kierkegaard and Simone Weil saw forgiveness as a radical act of freedom. For them, it's not about ignoring the wrong that was done, but about refusing to let it define your destiny. Kierkegaard would see resentment as an attachment to despair, a refusal to make space for something new. Simone Weil would call pure attention the ability to look at another person without the shadow of old wounds shaping your view. In psychoanalysis, Freud and later Melanie Klein would interpret persistent resentment as being stuck on an unprocessed trauma. The person mentally returns to the event as if, by reliving it, they might find a different outcome. But since the past can't be changed, the cycle repeats endlessly. Buddhist tradition offers another perspective. Resentment is one of the chains that keeps us tied to samsara, the cycle of suffering. As long as we feed our grudges, we're not in the present. We're clinging to the illusion of control over something that's already gone. Letting go of that attachment is like lifting an anchor that's holding you back from crossing over. The danger of resentment, then, isn't just the discomfort it causes, it's the space it takes up. It drains energy that could be spent creating, loving, learning. It also distorts meaning. We start interpreting new events through the lens of old wounds, repeating patterns that confirm our worst expectations. The underground man shows us the raw face of this prison. He's not unaware. He knows resentment limits him, but he'd rather keep it than face the uncertainty of life without it. This choice reveals an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, bitterness is easier to carry than the risk of starting over. Breaking free from resentment requires courage and maybe humility. It means accepting that the past doesn't have to have the last word, and that freedom begins when we stop letting old pain dictate our next steps. Dostoevsky doesn't hand us a manual for this, but he does give us the portrait of someone who failed at it. Seeing that, we can choose differently. You hear a simple statement, something obvious, almost impossible to disagree with. Most people would nod along without thinking twice, but the underground man feels an immediate discomfort, as if agreeing would mean submitting to some silent order. So, even knowing it's true, he pushes back. Not to prove he's right, but to prove he can still say no. For him, the danger isn't just in lies, it's in truths that become automatic. When something is too obvious, it stops being thought about. At that point, it turns into an unspoken rule, an invisible imposition. The underground man rebels against that, even if it means defying common sense or looking ridiculous. Dostoevsky frames this impulse as part of the radical freedom his character defends. It's not about chasing error, but about refusing automatism, as if saying, if all I do is follow what's already been predicted, then I'm not the one living, just a formula playing out. Contradiction, here, becomes a way of proving that life can't be contained in exact predictions. But this impulse comes with a price. Contradicting on principle can turn into a habit that isolates you, turning every conversation into a contest and every relationship into friction. The underground man experiences this. By constantly saying no, he builds walls, cutting himself off from others, and often from himself. Yet he'd rather be alone than give up this proof of autonomy. In his underground world, contradiction feels almost like a survival instinct. He refuses to play a part in a script already written, even if the role is advantageous. The pleasure of disappointing expectations is, for him, a reminder that he's still in control, or at least believes he is. Other philosophers have wrestled with this link between freedom and refusal. Nietzsche, for example, valued the spirit that can say no to what's taken for granted, but not as an end in itself. For him, negation should be the first step toward creating something new, not just an empty act of defiance. On this point, the underground man gets stuck in the negative phase, tearing down the predictable without replacing it with anything. Camus, when speaking of the rebel, saw that refusal can be noble when it defends an essential value. The problem is when refusal becomes automatic, losing its connection to any deeper meaning. The underground man lives exactly in that space. His no is pure gesture, without a cause beyond itself. In the skeptical tradition, philosophers like Pyrrho of Elis also questioned even the most obvious claims. But skepticism aimed at ataraxia, a calm born from suspending judgment. The underground man, by contrast, doesn't seek peace. He thrives on the tension contradiction creates. Kierkegaard might see this as a refusal to become a man of the crowd, someone who accepts truths simply because everyone else does. But he warned that true individuality requires more than saying no. It requires choosing something for yourself. On the flip side, thinkers like John Stuart Mill, while championing individual liberty, reminded us that denying for the sake of denial can be just as conformist as following for the sake of following. If refusal isn't born from personal judgment, but from an automatic reflex, it stops being freedom and becomes just another predictable reaction. In modern psychology, this drive to contradict is similar to what's called the reactance bias, the tendency to do the opposite of what's expected or requested, simply to reassert a sense of control. For the underground man, this isn't occasional, it's a way of life. Zen Buddhism would offer a radical contrast. Instead of contradicting to assert individuality, it teaches acting without attachment to either approval or opposition, dissolving the need to agree or disagree. To a Zen master, true freedom lies in not being conditioned by the urge to obey or to resist. Dostoevsky's warning is clear. When the impulse to contradict becomes a fixed identity, we stop judging each situation on its own merits and start reacting predictably to the predictable, a cruel irony for someone who wants to break patterns. In trying to escape predictability, the underground man becomes predictable in his refusal. Still, there's something valuable in this instinct. It reminds us that freedom includes the ability to question what everyone accepts without thinking. The problem isn't the no itself, it's stopping there. For negation to be fruitful, it has to make space for a yes that's truly our own. Dostoevsky doesn't resolve this contradiction in the underground man. He shows us the impulse in its raw form, its highs and its pitfalls. It's up to us to decide whether our no will be just a shout into the void or the first step toward creating something that truly defies the predictable. In Dostoevsky's underground world, boredom isn't just a harmless pause between two events. It's a heavy air that settles in and smothers any spark. The underground man feels the days repeating with the same dull texture. Every gesture feels pre-scripted, every conversation stripped of risk. In that atmosphere, even pain seems preferable. At least pain proves something is moving. Nothing terrifies him more than the sense that nothing has consequences, as if life could go on forever, flattened to its lowest level. It's not the lack of tasks that eats away at him, but the lack of friction. He needs an obstacle that forces him out of himself, something that calls him back into the world. Without it, his mind turns inward, chewing over old offenses, replaying possibilities, inventing little stories in which he triumphs, but never actually stepping into reality. Boredom, then, doesn't come from pure idleness. It comes from the mismatch between an overactive mind and a life without goals worth the risk. That's why he has a dangerous habit, stirring up conflict just to puncture the membrane of monotony. He creates small disasters, pokes at wounds, sabotages encounters, not from spontaneous malice, but from a hunger to feel. In Notes from Underground, 1864, this comes across as a rejection of domesticated, predictable, overly civilized existence. Where there's only calculation and comfort, he smells anesthesia, and like someone waking up a numb limb, he prefers the sting that brings sensation back. Boredom also feeds on ideals of perfection. When he imagines societies built of flawless machinery, the crystal palace of a fully rationalized life, the underground man sees a world without surprises, cracks, or bitter tastes. And that's exactly what drives him to despair. An order that erases rough edges also erases the possibility of the unexpected, and with it, the vividness of living. Here, boredom is the symptom of a peace that has lost its charm because it no longer knows contrast. Dostoevsky captures the vicious cycle. The less challenge there is, the more the underground retreats into his head. The more he lives in his head, the further his body drifts from the world. The more distance there is, the more flavorless everything becomes. Boredom then eats away from the inside, dissolving the urge to act. Eventually, even suffering becomes preferable, if only because it breaks the numbness. Boredom's poison doesn't kill all at once. It thins life down until there's barely a thread left. Other thinkers recognized this poison. Kierkegaard, in Either or 1843, declared, "Boredom is the root of all evil." He wasn't talking about passing annoyance, but the deep kind that comes from a lack of commitment. His cure was passionate choice, not just any burst of activity, but a leap that ties life to something that claims us entirely. The underground man fails exactly here. His passion is for analysis, not engagement. His leap is always postponed. Blaise Pascal, in Pensée, diagnosed a common strategy against boredom: divertissement, constant distraction. We chase games, wars, gossip, business, not for the content itself, but to avoid facing the void. The underground man does the same, but in a darker form. Instead of amusements, provocations. Instead of entertainment, recycled resentment. The mechanism is the same, dodging the confrontation with the lack of a vital purpose. Schopenhauer described human life as a pendulum swinging from suffering to boredom, the world as will and representation, 1819. We remove one lack only to fall into the dullness of wanting nothing. For him, there's no final solution, but creative projects and aesthetic contemplation can suspend this swing for moments at a time. Here, he touches on something the underground ignores. There are ways to escape boredom that don't involve destruction or intrigue, meaningful work, art, music, serious study that pulls us out of apathy without degrading us. Nietzsche saw boredom as a sign of a life that has forgotten how to affirm itself. A strong will transforms boredom into a chance for creation. The void becomes space for new values. In The Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the task is to overcome neutrality by inventing higher games, harder trials. For Nietzsche, the therapy isn't to numb boredom, but to go through it, until it turns into creative drive. Hannah Arendt, in The Human Condition, 1958, gave a political existential diagnosis. Without action, we remain private, even if we're surrounded by private tasks. It's the vita activa that places us in a shared world, where something unexpected can happen and be told. In the end, boredom is the feeling of having no story to tell. The underground man, locked in monologues, embodies the misery of someone with a mind, but no public plot. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, 1946, clinically observed that lack of purpose creates an existential vacuum. Without a why, any how becomes unbearable. Frankl quotes Nietzsche, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Applied to the underground man, the idea is devastating. His boredom isn't about a lack of stimulus, it's about the absence of a direction worth loyalty. He lacks tasks that call him to something greater than his own wounded sensitivity. Even the Stoics, often linked to inner peace, never celebrated inertia. Marcus Aurelius, in Meditations, insists, "If it is in your power, act. If not, accept." The antidote to boredom isn't constant excitement, but just and present action. Small works, duties carried out with attention. Seneca, in On the Shortness of Life, reminds us it's not that life is too short, it's that we waste it. Boredom wastes life not because of too few hours, but because of too little worthy occupation. Zen Buddhism adds a practical gesture, training presence until the simple regains depth. Washing a cup can be meaningless, or it can be an exercise in full attention. The difference is in the how. For someone gripped by boredom, this can be a good entry point. Small actions done completely, reconnecting mind and world, breaking the spell of neutrality. Dostoevsky's portrait stands as a warning. A daily life without real challenges or genuine conflicts hollows us out until we can't bear it. The fake conflicts the underground man creates show a desperation for intensity that could be channeled elsewhere, into a work, a cause, a serious study, a relationship that demands courage, a disciplined practice, anything that truly costs us something. The poison of boredom is neutralized when something asks us to change. Then, instead of provoking ruins just to feel, we return to building, and life regains its weight, its color, and its warmth. The underground man feels disgust toward any theory that tries to explain human beings as if they were perfectly predictable machines. For him, the idea that our choices are entirely determined by natural laws or social pressures isn't just false, it's offensive. To be reduced to the inevitable product of external forces is to him like being declared dead while still alive. In the underground, resisting determinism feels almost like a survival instinct. He realizes that if he were to fully accept that his actions are nothing more than the necessary results of prior causes, he would lose the feeling of authorship over his own life. And for him, that authorship, even if fragile and contradictory, is what gives dignity to existence. It's better to make a mistake by one's own choice than to be right out of conditioned reflex. The determinism he opposes isn't just the scientific kind based on physical laws, but also the social kind, which tries to predict behavior through statistics, customs, and cultural rules. The idea that some intelligent observer could anticipate his every step feels unbearable. That's why he values unpredictable gestures, even ones that don't benefit him, as a way of escaping the logic of inevitability. For Dostoevsky, this refusal has a deeper purpose. Without the ability to act against what's expected, there's no true freedom. The underground man even imagines situations where, knowing something is rational and beneficial, he would still choose the opposite, just to prove he isn't moved solely by a fixed chain of causes. That ability to break the logical sequence is, to him, the essence of being human. The risk of this mindset is obvious. Living constantly against the current can become self-destructive. But Dostoevsky prefers this risk to the passivity of someone who accepts being a cog in a machine. His character shows that the fight against absolute determinism is also a fight to preserve dignity, even if it means walking down harder roads. Other philosophers have wrestled with this tension. Sartre, in Existentialism, rejected any kind of metaphysical determinism. Man is condemned to be free. For him, there is no predefined human nature. We are what we choose to be, in every act. Even under oppressive social conditions, there is always a space, no matter how small, for choice. Sartre would agree with the underground man's rejection of the idea that we are just products of past causes. Kant, in a different way, also defended autonomy against determinism. While he acknowledged that in the phenomenal world everything follows natural laws, he maintained that, as moral agents, we also belong to the noumenal world, where freedom is possible. For him, to act morally is to act in a way that we can see as the expression of a law we choose for ourselves, not the result of a blind causal chain. Nietzsche, though rejecting free will in the traditional sense, believed in a creative freedom, the ability to revalue values, to affirm life in new ways. He recognized that we are shaped by biological and cultural forces, but insisted that a strong spirit can transform these forces into something new instead of simply reproducing them. On the other side of the debate, radical determinists like Spinoza claimed that freedom is simply the awareness of necessity. In other words, understanding why we act the way we do. For Spinoza, we don't choose absolutely. We follow the laws of nature, and the feeling of freedom is just a result of our partial understanding. The underground man would reject this outright, because for him, freedom isn't about understanding the chain, it's about being able to break it. In modern science, neuroscientists like Sam Harris argue that free will is an illusion, since every decision we make is the product of prior neural events we don't control. This view echoes the absolute determinism the underground man resists. Even if such explanations convince many, Dostoevsky's character would react with the same defiance. Accepting this would betray the very experience of choosing. Psychoanalysis, through Freud, introduced a subtler form of determinism. Our conscious choices are shaped by unconscious desires and childhood experiences. The underground man, aware of his own contradictions, might not deny this influence, but he would say that ultimately, freedom is the ability to act even when we know we're inclined to go another way. Buddhism offers another angle. Our actions arise from causes and conditions, but awareness can transform these causes by changing our relationship to them. There is no absolute freedom in the Western sense, but there is gradual liberation through mental and ethical training. The underground man might appreciate this idea, that even inside a web of causes, we can change the pattern. All of these perspectives show that the fight against absolute determinism isn't just philosophical, it's existential. It's about feeling like the agent of your own life, even while knowing that powerful forces shape who you are. The underground man's refusal to accept complete predictability is an act of preserving that inner experience of freedom. Dostoevsky invites us to consider that without some degree of unpredictability, without the real possibility of saying no to what's programmed or expected, the word freedom loses its meaning. And perhaps, to keep that possibility alive, sometimes you have to act against what seems inevitable, even if it costs you. The underground man isn't just allergic to lies and determinism. He also rejects the artificial safety of a script written by someone else. To him, following outside instructions, even if they lead to the right result, is a way of giving up his own life. It's better to stumble along your own path than to walk flawlessly down someone else's road. This conviction comes from the value he places on authorship. When he makes a mistake by his own choice, the underground man feels that mistake belongs to him. He may suffer the consequences, but at least they're his, not the product of a social, moral, or political system treating him like a cog in the machine. It's the opposite of living under guardianship. And to him, guardianship is more humiliating than failure. In Notes from Underground, this shows up as stubborn resistance to truths imposed from the outside. The promise of a perfect life, risk-free and based solely on rational rules, doesn't attract him. On the contrary, it bothers him, feels inhuman. In such a life, even mistakes would be avoided by design. And with that, the deepest kind of learning would disappear. For the underground man, mistakes have a value that automatic correctness doesn't. They are lived, felt, absorbed. They force you to deal with reality directly, without intermediaries. A pre-written script might keep you from suffering, but it also keeps you from living fully. The lesson that comes from your own mistake is more intimate and transformative than any ready-made advice or commandment. This defense of the dignity of error is not an endorsement of ignorance or carelessness. It's praise for the freedom to experiment, for the right to find out for yourself the limits and consequences of your own actions. In the underground, dignity isn't in the final result. It's in the act of choosing for yourself. Of course, the risk is that this attachment to autonomy can turn into a refusal to listen or learn from others' experience. The underground man walks that fine line. But Dostoevsky makes it clear that for him, even the pain of a conscious mistake is better than the obedience of someone living by a script. Other philosophers have recognized this tension. John Stuart Mill, in On Liberty, wrote that the man who has no opinions of his own is nothing. For Mill, developing individuality requires space to experiment and even to fail. Societies that protect their members from all mistakes condemn them to mediocrity. Nietzsche saw voluntary error as a form of creative strength. The free spirit doesn't follow ready-made maps. He takes risks, even knowing some paths will lead to dead ends. For him, blindly obeying inherited morality is more shameful than making mistakes while trying to create your own values. Kierkegaard approached the issue from an existential perspective. A personal choice, even a wrong one, is more authentic than correct obedience. The individual only truly becomes themselves by owning their decisions, with all the weight and responsibility that entails. In this sense, error is a mark of authenticity. Kant, though a defender of universal moral laws, would partly agree. For him, autonomy is the ability to act according to laws we give ourselves. That means a correct action only has moral worth if done from one's own conviction, not mere external conformity. Making a mistake while trying to act autonomously is morally superior to being right through submission. On the opposite side, more paternalistic thinkers might argue that avoiding mistakes is a social duty, that it's better to prevent bad individual choices for the sake of the collective. But this view risks infantilizing the individual, treating them as incapable of carrying their own freedom. This is exactly what the underground man resists. In psychology, Carl Jung said individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires confronting your own shadow, and that includes making mistakes. Without personal experience of error, there is no true integration of the personality. In Eastern tradition, Taoism values learning through direct contact with the path, Tao. Laozi suggests the path can't be fully described. Each person must experience it. That means no outside instruction can replace living it, and stumbles are part of the flow. Buddhism, on the other hand, warns that ego attachment can lead to repeated mistakes. For the Buddha, a mistake only has dignity if it's paired with awareness and learning. Making mistakes just to prove independence without understanding is wasteful. Here, the underground man might be criticized for holding on to certain errors as a badge of freedom, even when they no longer teach him anything. The dignity of error, then, is not about making mistakes for their own sake, but about making them because you dare to choose. A pre-written script might protect you from immediate harm, but it robs you of the growth that comes from facing the world with your own hands and mind. That growth is what allows us to create meaning, not just repeat what we've been given. Through the underground man, Dostoevsky leaves us with the image of someone willing to bear the weight of consequences in order to preserve his authorship. The message is clear. A life with no room for personal error may be more comfortable, but it's less human. The underground man knows pain well, not just the pain the world has given him, but the pain he has chosen to carry himself. For him, there's a huge difference between suffering because you were forced to and suffering because you decided to. In the first case, he feels reduced to a passive object, at the mercy of outside forces. In the second, he keeps a sense of authorship, even if the price is high. To someone who sees pain only as something to be avoided, this distinction might sound absurd. But for the underground man, chosen pain is a sign of freedom. It's proof that he's not living according to a script imposed on him, whether by social conventions or systems that promise happiness in exchange for obedience. Accepting an imposed pleasure might feel more comfortable, but to him, it's a form of submission, like accepting a pre-packaged life in the name of safety. In Notes from Underground, this logic shows up whenever the character confronts utopian ideas of a perfect society. The crystal palace he's offered promises to wipe out all human suffering. He refuses. Not because he loves pain itself, but because he knows that such a world would also eliminate genuine choice. If every pleasure came ready-made, handed out by some rational mechanism, there would be no room to choose something different, and it's in that space that he sees life's true dignity. Imposed pleasure, no matter how intense, doesn't fully belong to the one receiving it. It belongs to whoever decides to give it. Chosen pain, on the other hand, is by definition an act of ownership. It carries the mark of someone who has said, "I'm taking this road," even knowing it will hurt. For the underground man, that mark is worth more than any comfort handed from outside. Of course, there's a danger here. Choosing pain can turn into a habit, a kind of self-sabotage disguised as freedom. Dostoevsky doesn't hide this ambiguity. His character swings between genuine courage and pointless self-destruction. Still, he insists, and the author forces us to face the question: how far are we willing to trade the uncertainty of our own path for the safety of guaranteed pleasure? Other philosophers also explored this reversal of values. Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil and on the genealogy of morals, speaks about the importance of embracing suffering as part of self-affirmation. For him, greatness comes from the ability to endure and even seek out painful challenges rather than settling for pleasures that weaken us. His idea of amor fati, loving one's fate, means embracing the inevitable pains and even the chosen ones as integral parts of life. Kierkegaard, on the other hand, saw chosen suffering as an essential part of faith and existential authenticity. In Fear and Trembling, he describes Abraham's willingness to endure extreme pain for a personal commitment to God. Here, the choice of pain isn't about stubbornness. It's about loyalty to something greater than immediate comfort. In Stoic philosophy, the goal isn't to seek pain, but there's an understanding that voluntarily enduring hardship strengthens character. Seneca, in On the Tranquility of the Mind, suggests practicing deprivation so that when adversity comes, it won't break us. Choosing small discomforts, like giving up certain luxuries, can be better than living as a hostage to pleasures that make us weak. In Buddhism, imposed pleasure could be seen as a trap of attachment. We receive something pleasant, but we didn't choose it, and so we don't control it. Chosen pain, when guided by compassion or discipline, can be part of the path to liberation. Monastics, who follow strict vows, don't do it out of love for suffering, but because they recognize that conscious renunciation strengthens the mind and heart. Jean-Paul Sartre also adds a relevant view. For him, freedom means carrying the weight of our choices, even when they hurt. Running to impose pleasures is giving up that freedom. From an existentialist perspective, chosen pain is more authentic because it's tied to responsibility and therefore to identity itself. On the other side, classical utilitarianism with Bentham and Mill would see little value here. For them, the measure of good is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Choosing to suffer when safe pleasure is available would be irrational. The underground man, of course, would see this as yet another attempt to reduce human life to cost-benefit calculations and would reject it in defense of the unpredictability of will. Modern psychology actually shows there's some truth to chosen suffering. Studies on resilience suggest that difficult experiences, when faced voluntarily, can increase our sense of control and life satisfaction. It's not the pain itself that has value, but the feeling of being in charge of your own path. The lesson is that the value of an experience isn't just in how it feels, pleasant or painful, but in how much autonomy it involves. An imposed pleasure, no matter how sweet, can leave a bitter taste of alienation. A chosen pain, no matter how bitter, can carry the flavor of freedom. The underground man, with all his contradictions, reminds us that living fully isn't about accepting everything pleasant and avoiding everything painful. It's about making conscious choices and accepting their price. In that sense, chosen pain can be more valuable than imposed pleasure because it bears the seal of our own will. The underground man lives in a narrow, uncomfortable borderland between extreme clarity and complete paralysis. He sees too much, understands too much, analyzes too much, but acts too little. His awareness is so sharp that every possibility comes with a full dossier of consequences, contradictions, and risks. And while he's busy weighing it all, the moment to act is already gone. This is the core dilemma: how to live without giving up clarity, but also without letting that clarity block movement. For the underground man, acting blindly is unbearable, but so is watching life unfold without his participation. He's stuck in this double bind. He doesn't want to be unconscious, yet he can't turn his awareness into action. His sharp vision makes every decision feel like a minefield. Where others see a simple path, he sees dozens of possible forks, each hiding its own traps. He knows every choice comes with loss, and that awareness of cost paralyzes him. It's as if the weight of knowing outweighs the strength to act. Dostoevsky builds this impasse as more than just a personal weakness. It's almost a sickness of modernity, a symptom of the overthinking that comes with literate, critical, information-saturated societies. The underground man isn't just an isolated figure. he's a prophetic portrait of many of us today, thinking so much about living that we end up living very little. This dilemma isn't solved by simply adding more courage or discipline. It requires a kind of practical wisdom, accepting that no action will ever be perfect, that there will always be uncertainty and mistakes, and acting anyway. The underground man fails here because he wants a guarantee life will never give, and while he waits, time moves on, relentlessly. Other philosophers recognize this challenge. Kierkegaard called it the anxiety of possibility, a state where awareness widens the field of choices so much that choosing becomes impossible. His solution was the leap of faith, an act that even without rational guarantees commits us to a direction. It's an antidote to paralysis by endless reflection. Hannah Arendt, in distinguishing between thinking and acting, reminded us that action is what places us in the world, creating something that didn't exist before. The underground man is trapped in a vita contemplativa without the counterbalance of vita activa. He thinks enough to understand life, but not enough to truly experience it. William James, the pragmatist, would say that the truth of an idea is proven only in practice. No matter how clear the reasoning, it remains incomplete without real testing. The underground man's problem, in this sense, is living as if the perfect answer could be found through thinking alone, when, in reality, only action can provide the answers he's looking for. Nietzsche, critical of passivity, would see this hesitation as a symptom of decay. Life, for him, is will in action, and clarity should be used to create and affirm, not to hold back. A spirit that knows but does not do, Nietzsche would say, is a spirit refusing to dance. In Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius offers a different balance. Think to act well. Act so you don't get lost in thought. Clarity without movement is sterile. Movement without clarity is blind. The art lies in alternating the two. A Stoic might tell the underground man, accept you can't control everything and act on what's within your reach. Buddhism also warns of the danger of being trapped in the mind. Meditation is not an end in itself, but preparation to live with presence and compassion in the real world. Staying forever in observation mode is just attachment disguised as awareness. The path is to turn clarity into action that reduces suffering, both your own and others. Psychoanalysis, through Freud, might interpret the dilemma as a conflict between a critical superego and a desiring ego. The mind, caught in rigid demands and inner rules, blocks the flow of action. The balance would come from loosening those standards and accepting the risk of error. The real challenge isn't choosing between awareness or action, but learning to integrate them. Acute awareness is a rare gift. Without it, we risk superficiality. But isolated, it becomes a mental prison. Practical action, on the other hand, without reflection, can be productive but also destructive. The underground man gives us a double warning. Living without thinking is dangerous, but thinking without living is fatal. The balance is to act with awareness and think with a readiness to act. It's a rhythm, not a formula. Dostoevsky makes it clear that this dilemma is never solved once and for all. Life is dynamic. There are moments to dive into reflection and moments to leap into reality. The mistake is clinging to only one. The underground man is a picture of what happens when we get stuck in thought. A vast inner world, but an almost non-existent outer life. Maybe what saves us from that fate is accepting that balance is never fixed, but a constant negotiation. Acting before knowing everything, and thinking before doing anything, but without expecting perfection from either side. Awareness should light the way, not block the path. The underground man doesn't measure the value of a decision by its practical outcome. He measures it by how much that decision expresses his will. If it's truly his, born from his own choice and not from obedience, then it matters, even if it's absurd, even if it leads to loss. In his logic, a voluntary mistake is better than an imposed success. For him, living only by what is rational and useful is the same as being a cog in a machine. It doesn't matter how comfortable the mechanism is. If all your actions can be predicted by some external calculation, then your freedom is just for show. Life, in that case, becomes a perfect script with no room for improvisation. And improvising, even badly, is what makes him feel alive. In Notes from Underground, this attitude shows up in his contempt for the Crystal Palace, a symbol of a society organized down to the smallest detail, with no space for contradictions. Such a world, he says, might be efficient, but it would be unlivable for anyone who wants to assert themselves as a person. Without the chance to do something illogical, to go against what's supposedly best, life becomes a transparent prison. The underground man sees will as a force that doesn't need constant justification. It is, by itself, the foundation of action. When everyone expects him to choose A, he might choose B, not out of spite, but to feel the weight of ownership over that decision. Even if B is a terrible choice from an objective standpoint, it still carries the stamp of authorship. Of course, this impulse comes with a high cost. Absurd decisions can cause real harm, close doors, and create regrets. But to him, there's something worse than facing the consequences of a bad choice. Living with the certainty that he never truly chose at all. Risk and uncertainty are part of what he sees as freedom. Dostoevsky doesn't present this position as an absolute virtue. He shows that the same force that guarantees autonomy can also lead to self-sabotage and isolation. But for his character, living without asserting his own will is living like a shadow. And a shadow, even without wounds, doesn't live. Other philosophers have touched on this view, each with different nuances. Nietzsche, for example, valued the will to power, the ability to create your own values and shape your life accordingly. For him, an act that seems absurd to common morality could be the highest expression of creative strength. The decision matters not because it's sensible, but because it's a unique affirmation of who we are. Sartre, in Existentialism, reinforces that we are condemned to be free and therefore responsible for everything we do. An absurd choice, for him, is still an act of freedom if made consciously. Authenticity comes from owning the decision, not from following what is logical or socially approved. Kierkegaard saw in the absurd decision a place for the leap of faith. He wasn't talking about irrational acts out of whim, but those that defy conventional reason because they answer to a deeper commitment. For him, the absurd can be the path to personal truth, as long as it's not an escape, but a surrender. On the other hand, utilitarian thinkers like John Stuart Mill would argue that the value of a decision lies in its impact on well-being. An absurd choice that brings more suffering than happiness would, in that view, be a mistake to avoid. The underground man would reject this as yet another way of measuring life by external standards. In Stoic philosophy, there would be criticism of this impulse. For Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, freedom means acting in harmony with universal reason. Making absurd decisions just to assert your will would, for them, be a waste of energy and a sign of poor self-control. Still, even among the Stoics, there's an acknowledgement that living as a mere executor of external orders is unworthy. In psychology, Viktor Frankl offers a middle ground. In Man's Search for Meaning, he shows that life gains value when we find a purpose worth living for, and that this purpose can require decisions that seem absurd to others. Here, the absurd isn't the goal, but the price you're willing to pay to stay true to something of your own. Buddhism would bring another lens. Will, when driven by ego, can lead to absurd decisions that fuel suffering. But when guided by compassion and clarity, it can break conditioned patterns, even if it looks illogical from the outside. In this sense, asserting the will can be freeing, if it's not tied to the need to prove something. The real question is where to draw the line between healthy will and self-sabotage. The underground man doesn't worry much about that. For him, simply choosing against what's expected is already a win. But Dostoevsky, by showing the consequences of this stance, invites us to reflect. Is freedom just doing whatever you want? Or is it also choosing what keeps life open to the future? Life as an assertion of the will, as the underground man lives it, is a gamble. It can give us a life rich in authenticity or push us into a dead end. But for him, the worst defeat is living without betting at all. In that sense, even an absurd decision can have value, not for the result, but because it marks the moment we stop being spectators and become authors. The underground man lives in constant war against anything that tries to frame him as a predictable part of a system. For him, there's no greater humiliation than being reduced to a fixed, repetitive function, something that could be replaced without anyone even noticing. Being just another one in the social machine is to him a kind of living death. This refusal doesn't come only from pride, it's a matter of survival. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky puts him face to face with ideals of perfectly organized societies, free of conflict, where each person plays their role like a part in a human clock. Instead of admiration, he feels disgust. What's presented as harmony, to him, is really a transparent prison, where every move is calculated and every reaction anticipated. The underground man wants to be unpredictable, even if it means going against his own interests. He sees the unexpected gesture as proof that he's still free. If the system knows he'll do A, he might choose B, not because B is better, but simply to escape control. It's his way of shouting that life isn't an equation, and humans can't be reduced to an assembly line. This refusal is also a way to protect his dignity. A cog can be useful, even essential, but it's never irreplaceable. If you accept being nothing more than that, you lose your uniqueness. The underground man would rather risk failing on his own than function perfectly for someone else's plan. He distrusts any promise of happiness that depends on giving up autonomy. The cost of this stance is high. Outside the machine, there are no guarantees, only instability and loneliness. But for him, that's a small price compared to losing his individuality. Dostoevsky shows us a character who would rather face the anxiety of deciding for himself than the comfort of being placed smoothly into a system. Other philosophers have recognized this same human need to break free from the machine. Hannah Arendt, in The Human Condition, speaks of the public sphere as the place where we appear as individuals, capable of beginning something new and unpredictable. To be reduced to a function is to lose that capacity to initiate. It's to live without leaving a mark. Nietzsche also fought against the herd mentality that turns individuals into obedient cogs. For him, greatness lies in standing against the collective morality when it suffocates creative will. The free spirit refuses to simply repeat what's been established, even if that means facing isolation. Kierkegaard approached this from an existential perspective. Being just a part of the machine is to be the crowd man, someone who lives for approval and follows patterns without reflection. For him, true life demands personal ownership of choices, even if it means moving away from the masses and standing exposed. Sartre, in Existentialism, reinforced that man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Living like a cog is giving up this creative task, letting social structures decide for us. He would say that the underground man, despite his contradictions, preserves something essential: the refusal to be fully defined by pre-made roles. On the other side, functionalist thinkers like Emil Durkheim might argue that integration into the social machine isn't just inevitable, but necessary for cohesion. Every piece plays a role that sustains the whole. From this perspective, the challenge isn't to leave the machine, but to find meaning within it. The underground man would reject this, seeing it as just another disguise for the loss of real freedom. In psychology, Erich Fromm, in Escape from Freedom, warns about the temptation to give up autonomy in exchange for security. Being a cog is comfortable because it removes the need to choose, but it's also the path to an empty existence. Fromm argued that freedom is demanding. It brings responsibility, and that's why many prefer to avoid it. In Eastern traditions, Taoism sees the individual as part of the whole, but not as a mechanical piece. Every element of the Tao has its own unique flow, and harmony doesn't require uniformity. The social machine, on the other hand, tends to smooth out differences to maintain efficiency. It's exactly that efficiency the underground man fears, because it comes at the cost of spontaneity. Buddhism would add that the fixed identity of being a piece is an illusion. We are processes, constantly changing. But while the social machine insists on defining us rigidly, Buddhist practice aims to dissolve those fixations so that action can be free, not programmed. The refusal to be a cog, then, is more than just rebellion. It's the defense of a space where life can still surprise us. It's insisting that not all our responses can be predicted, that not all our paths can be mapped from the outside. It's accepting the discomfort of not fitting in order to preserve the possibility of creating. The underground man shows us that living as a cog might be efficient, but it will rarely be fulfilling. And that, to preserve the dignity of being more than a machine part, we must be willing to risk being seen as a flaw in the system. The underground man speaks as if holding a double-edged knife. On one side, the blade of irony cuts others. On the other, it cuts himself. His sarcasm is sharp, but never random. It's an armor. He uses it to shield himself from a vulnerability he refuses to expose. When he mocks others or himself, he's building an invisible barrier. Come close, but not too close. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky presents him as someone who can't talk about his own pain without wrapping it in a biting tone. When he shares his frustrations, there's always a touch of comic exaggeration, an irony that softens the weight of the confession. It's as if the acidic humor turns humiliation into a temporary victory. If he laughs first, no one else can laugh at him with the same force. This sarcasm is both a sign of fear and an affirmation of autonomy. Fear of being hurt through direct exposure, fear of being seriously judged. Autonomy because, by interpreting and twisting reality through his own ironic lens, he keeps narrative control over his life. The joke, even when bitter, is his. He decides where the cut lands. The underground man knows irony has a numbing effect. By coating suffering in laughter, he lessens the immediate sting of pain. But he also knows this protection comes at a cost: isolation. Constant sarcasm pushes people away, blocks sincere connections, and keeps everyone on the outside of the wall. It's an effective defense against intrusion, but also against affection. The fear behind this posture runs deep. It comes from repeated experiences of feeling out of place, of realizing his thoughts and desires don't fit into the social mold. By anticipating judgment with a joke, he tries to make sure he's never caught off guard. In this way, ironic laughter becomes a preemptive counterattack. Still, Dostoevsky makes it clear that the underground man's irony isn't purely negative. It's also a way to preserve a piece of mental independence. By refusing to speak in a straightforward, conformist way, he keeps alive the sense that he isn't predictable. His biting tone breaks the standard language, preventing others from neatly fitting him into ready-made categories. This ambiguity, protection, and prison echoes in other philosophers and writers. Kierkegaard, for example, dedicated an entire book, The Concept of Irony, to analyzing this stance. For him, irony can be destructive when it can't affirm anything at all, but it can also be freeing when it challenges cliches and opens space for a more authentic life. Nietzsche, though critical of sterile cynicism, valued irreverence as a weapon against dogmatic truths. In this sense, irony is a hammer. It breaks what's too rigid to make room for something new. The underground man, by mocking utopian ideas or cold logic, keeps the possibility of the unexpected alive. Freud saw sarcasm as a defense mechanism, a way to turn aggressive impulses and frustrations into something more socially acceptable: humor. But he warned that, used excessively, it blocks genuine emotional processing and acts as an escape. In political philosophy, Hannah Arendt would note that irony can be a tool of resistance. It prevents the dominant narrative from fully taking over the imagination. When the underground man mocks promises of a perfect society, he's refusing to be absorbed by a story he doesn't see as his own. Stoicism, on the other hand, would see excessive irony as a waste of energy. Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus would recommend frankness and self-control, speaking directly without harm or hiding. as a sign of self-mastery. For a Stoic, sarcasm is more of a reaction than a deliberate action. In Eastern traditions, especially Zen Buddhism, there's space for a kind of humor that isn't defense, but illumination. Koans and paradoxical answers that seem to mock common logic, but actually invite its transcendence. The difference is that this humor doesn't come from fear or bitterness, but from an inner freedom the underground man doesn't have. Modern psychology shows that self-deprecating humor in moderation can signal social intelligence and resilience. But when it becomes a constant pattern, it can reinforce low self-esteem and block genuine intimacy. The underground man fits this description. His sarcasm isn't light-hearted, it's heavy armor. The dilemma is that for someone who lives behind this armor, dropping it feels terrifying. Irony is part of his identity. Without it, he fears becoming too vulnerable. Yet the same irony that gives him narrative control also keeps him away from the experiences that could lessen his fear. Dostoevsky gives us a complex portrait: sarcasm as both trench and watchtower. The underground man, even in isolation, keeps his critical view and his freedom of thought, but he pays for it with his own loneliness. The takeaway is that irony, when used as defense, is a powerful but double-edged tool. It protects, yes, but it also limits. It's a means of clarity and a shield against pain, but it can become a prison if it's never set aside. The challenge is learning to wield this blade without constantly cutting yourself. The underground man is a prisoner of time, but not of real time. He lives surrounded by memories, revisiting every detail of what has already happened, replaying conversations and imagining better answers that will never be spoken. At the same time, he projects himself into a hypothetical future, full of plans, possibilities, and idealized acts of revenge. Between these two realms, the present barely exists. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky builds this prison with care. Every move the character makes is filtered through reflections on something that has already happened, or hasn't happened yet. He is always explaining himself to an imaginary court or plotting victories that depend on uncertain circumstances. The now, the only moment where life truly unfolds, slips away like water through his fingers. This absence from the present isn't laziness, it's escape. The present is dangerous because it demands direct contact with reality without the comfortable filter of time's distance. In the past, he can edit the story, casting himself as hero or victim whenever he wants. In the future, he can imagine a flawless outcome with no real risk. The now, however, is uncertain and inevitably imperfect, and that terrifies him. The underground man finds in this temporal evasion a way to avoid the responsibility of immediate action. If he's reviewing the past, he doesn't have to decide anything. If he's projecting into the future, he also doesn't have to act now. The problem is that, in doing so, real life starts to empty out. He replaces it with mentally comfortable but lifeless versions. Dostoevsky uses this behavior to illustrate a larger danger. Intelligence and awareness, if not anchored in the present, can become tools of alienation. Knowing a lot about what was and what could be is useless if it's never turned into action and experience in the moment you're living. Other philosophers saw this same risk. Kierkegaard spoke of the despair of evasion, the constant attempt to escape oneself through temporal distractions. For him, to live authentically is to accept the weight of the moment and act from it, even if that action is small and imperfect. Nietzsche, with his concept of amor fati, calls for a radical embrace of the present, not just accepting it, but loving it exactly as it is. This means letting go of hope for a redeeming future and nostalgia for an idealized past. The idea of eternal recurrence is his test. If you had to live this moment over and over forever, could you affirm it? For the underground man, the answer would probably be no, and that no keeps him trapped. The Stoics also valued presence as a discipline. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "Confine yourself to the present. Epictetus advised not to suffer over past events or worry about the future, because only the present is within our control. To them, living outside the present was to waste the only thing you truly have. Buddhism, especially through the practice of mindfulness, places the present at the center of spiritual experience. Past and future exist only as mental constructions. Clinging to them is losing touch with reality. Being fully in the now is the path to reducing suffering and increasing clarity. William James, in Pragmatism, observed that consciousness is a stream, and staying anchored in the present is essential for effective action. A mind scattered between what has been and what will be loses its force in what it can do now. In this sense, the underground man is the perfect example of how too much reflection on other times drains the energy of the moment. In contemporary psychology, rumination, replaying past events over and over, and anticipatory anxiety, worrying excessively about the future, are linked to higher levels of depression and stress. Studies show that life satisfaction rises when we can direct our attention and energy to the present. The urgency of the present doesn't mean ignoring the past or the future. It means understanding that they only have real value when used to guide the now. The past is stored experience, the future, possibility. But the present is the only ground where you can plant anything. Living stuck in the other two is like studying maps and weather forecasts without ever stepping outside to plant the field. The underground man reminds us, in a negative way, that the absence of presence distances us not only from opportunities, but also from other people. Real human connections happen in the shared time of now. A conversation, a gesture of affection, a joint decision, all require present attention. Living in another timeline means being physically there, but emotionally absent. The way out of this trap takes courage. Being in the present is opening yourself to unpredictability, to mistakes, to discomfort. But it's also the only way to have full experiences and build a life that isn't just memory or expectation. By creating the underground man, Dostoevsky doesn't just criticize escaping the now. He challenges us to face how often we do the same, even if in more subtle ways. The urgency of the present is not just practical advice, it's an existential demand. Without it, the past and the future become walls that enclose and suffocate real life. At the end of Notes from Underground, there's no neatly packaged moral lesson and no promise of redemption. The underground man doesn't turn into a hero, nor does he find the formula for happiness. What remains is a blunt warning. Wasting your life is easier than you think, and the surest way to do it is by running away from freedom. For Dostoevsky, this escape takes many forms. It can be blind obedience to rules, surrendering to utilitarian logic, accepting a fixed role in the social machine, or hiding behind endless reflection. They all have one thing in common: refusing to take the risk of choosing. And choosing, even without guarantees, is what keeps life alive. The underground man, with all his contradictions, embodies this tension. He knows freedom is painful. There's no way to exercise your own will without losing the comfort of certainty. Being free means being constantly exposed to the possibility of mistakes, regret, and criticism. It's safer to follow what others have already decided, but it's also emptier. Dostoevsky's final appeal is that we should never trade life for the illusion of safety. That safety might come disguised as perfect rationality or stable social order, but it always demands the same price: giving up personal choice. In the underground, that surrender is the true waste, far worse than any failure. Facing freedom means enduring the pain of watching old certainties crumble. Often, those certainties are what keep us standing. Beliefs about who we are, how the world should work, or which paths guarantee success. When we decide for ourselves, we give up those crutches and start walking uncertain ground. That's where life truly begins, and also where the fear that paralyzes so many people lives. The underground man shows us that freedom isn't romantic, it's rough. It demands that we hold contradictions, deal with unexpected consequences, and accept that there won't always be an obvious right answer. But that roughness is what makes it real. Freedom without pain is almost always an illusion sold to keep people obedient without realizing it. Other philosophers echoed the same warning. Sartre, in Existentialism, said, "Man is condemned to be free, not as a punishment, but as an unavoidable fact." Running from that condemnation is living inauthentically. For him, accepting freedom meant taking full responsibility for who you are without blaming fate or society. Nietzsche saw freedom not just as the absence of chains, but as the ability to create your own values. That act of creation is always an act of destruction. To affirm new meanings, you must tear down old idols. The pain of freedom lies exactly in this work of demolition and rebuilding. The underground man, even when lost in skepticism, understands the weight of that task. Kierkegaard saw freedom as a leap, something that can't be fully explained by reason, because it involves risk and uncertainty. For him, to live is to choose without any guarantee of success, and that choice is what makes us individuals before God and before ourselves. Without that leap, we remain stuck in lifeless repetition. Hannah Arendt, speaking about politics and action, reminded us that freedom is proven in the ability to start something new. But starting always means breaking with what's already established, and that inevitably provokes discomfort, resistance, and even pain. The comfort of conformity is the enemy of this creative freedom. The Stoics, though more cautious, also tied freedom to self-mastery. For Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, being free meant not being a slave to circumstances or to your passions. That requires facing the pain of giving up easy pleasures and comfortable certainties in favor of a life aligned with consciously chosen principles. Buddhism offers a different but related perspective. True freedom is detachment, and letting go hurts. It hurts to release beliefs, expectations, and the fixed idea of an unchanging self. But that detachment is what frees us from self-imposed suffering. Modern psychology confirms that avoiding hard choices to maintain immediate comfort often leads, in the long run, to dissatisfaction. Research on motivation shows that life's meaning is tied more to autonomy and purpose than to constant pleasure. Freedom, then, is a condition for a meaningful life, even if it's uncomfortable. Dostoevsky's appeal, in the end, is that we should not let the fear of pain push us into a mechanical life. The risk of freedom is real. We can fail, lose, suffer. But the risk of non-freedom is greater. Living as a spectator to a life that could have been ours, but was handed over for others to manage. Not wasting life from this perspective isn't about making the most of every moment in a shallow sense, but having the courage to act according to your own will and to carry the weight of that choice. It's choosing an uncertain but personal path over a safe road we never chose ourselves. The underground man is both a warning and a mirror. A warning because he shows the dangers of letting fear and endless analysis paralyze us. A mirror because, in some way, we've all felt the urge to trade freedom for comfortable certainties. Dostoevsky's final message is that there are no shortcuts. To live is to face freedom as it is, imperfect, uncomfortable, demanding. Running from it is, quietly, to start dying before your time. And so, we've reached the end of this journey through the depths of Dostoevsky and the human dilemmas he revealed like few others could. If any of these reflections stirred something in you, if a certain phrase has been echoing in your mind, then our time together today was already worth it. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these ideas challenged you the most? Where did you see yourself in this? Leave your comment below. Your perspective and experience might inspire others who are also trying to live more consciously. If this video brought you value, hit the like button so YouTube knows this content deserves to reach more people. Share it with friends who love philosophy, literature, or who, like the underground man, are are always questioning the meaning of life. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. Here, every video is an invitation to think deeper and feel life more closely. Don't leave just yet. There's plenty more content waiting for you here on the channel. Keep watching, dive into the other videos, and let's keep going together on this search for answers, or at least for better questions. See you in the next video.